Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Chris Robinson, and I serve as a Director of Clinical Resources for the National Commission on Orthotic and Prosthetic Education. NCOPE's mission is improving lives and strengthening the profession through education. And I'd like to take a brief moment to discuss the NCOPE Residency, the second half of your O&P education. Learning objectives. Present NCOPE's position on sexual misconduct, harassment, and discrimination within the workplace. Review NCOPE's mission and goals. Introduce the NCOPE staff. Review the evolution of the O&P school graduate. Identify the current O&P professional climate. Discuss the role of the NCOPE Residency Standards and how they shape the delivery of the residency program. Discuss the role of data in NCOPE's operations and sources of information. And last but not least, we'll provide a brief tour of the NCOPE website and other relevant online resources for future, current, and past residents. NCOPE's position on sexual misconduct, harassment, and discrimination in the workplace. In partnership with the Harassment Advocacy Work Group, ABC, BOC, the NAAOP, AOPA, and the Academy, NCOPE issued an open letter stating that these behaviors are illegal and have no place in the O&P community. This letter generates a clear message that we support a zero-tolerance policy for these behaviors and any discrimination based on sex, race, color, national origin, religion, age, and disability, and also are strongly against retaliation for the reporting of such conduct. We'd like to remind all individuals watching this presentation that certified and licensed professionals witnessing such behavior have an obligation to report it to the appropriate credentialing organization. As mentioned on our opening slide, NCOPE's mission is improving lives and strengthening the profession through education. We've broken this down into 4 key goals to achieve our mission. 1. Strengthen education and clinical experiences. This was drafted intentionally as it recognizes the junction between an academic setting and real-world clinical training. 2. Optimize the collection, use, and dissemination of data for the benefit of the profession. 3. Demonstrate value of NCOPE services and role. And 4. Attract a more racially and ethnically diverse cohort of students to select O&P as a career so the future workforce better reflects the population that it serves. We'll explore how these goals are interwoven into the education and residency structure over the next few minutes. Now, while the NCOPE staff certainly has lofty goals, we have just 4 individuals serving on the staff on a full-time basis. Ms. Robin Seabrook has been with NCOPE since its inception. Myself, Chris Robinson, the Clinical Resource Director. The most important thing you may notice with the credentialing is that I am a fellow certified prosthetist orthotist. So I've taken a CAHEP education in order to become credentialed and completed separate NCOPE residencies in orthotics and prosthetics, respectively. We also have 2 members of the team that are going to be largely responsible for the administration of the residency program, Ms. Claire Doyle and Mr. Eric Waters. During your residency, these individuals will be your primary points of contact. The evolution of the O&P student. The American Board for Certification conducts a practice analysis roughly every 5 years, with the most recent one occurring in 2015. Within the 1,400 responses provided, 28% of individuals practicing predominantly as an orthotist identified as female, while just 18% of individuals practicing predominantly in prosthetics, identified as female. Of that note, this is actually a considerable increase from previous years. But for a little bit more context, we can look at the timeline of our longest standing O&P school. Northwestern University has gender data dating back to the 1980s, and in 1982, just 8% of the enrolled students were female. In 2004, this was the initial cohort where males and females were 50-50. I graduated from this program during that year. And for more context, the cohort that graduated in 2020 was 63% female. And this isn't just a trend at Northwestern University. If we look across the data provided by all programs, all students that graduated in the 2019 academic year, 43% were female and 57% were male. So we're seeing a considerable gender shift, and this is consistent with other professions. When physical therapy moved from an entry-level baccalaureate degree to a master's degree, they too observed a considerable increase in female student enrollment. And while the gender shift is certainly a variable and a factor that many prospective residency directors are curious about, what's most important is the fact that the training and education of the O&P student has changed. The clinical assessment skills that are provided to individuals at master's level programs is considerably more in-depth. Evidence-based practice models are interwoven throughout. The ability to engage in technical writing and graduate level writing exercises is essential, not only for communication, but even reimbursement if you want to define medical necessity, for example. And last, but certainly not least, the role of interdisciplinary care models. The fact that the prosthetist orthotist engages with multiple unique healthcare providers, and even the way they interface with the patient, their caregivers, and family are factors that are much more deeply understood by individuals graduating at the master's level. It is important to recognize that the skills needed for clinical practice in O&P will always be different, depending on the unique setting, or even over time as modalities change and improve. The development of microprocessor knees has drastically changed the approach to the way individuals manage persons at the transfemoral level, for example. But regardless of the evolution within the clinical settings and the technologies that we're able to provide patients, or educational standards, there's one fundamental difference when we transition to the entry-level graduate degree at the master's level. Current O&P students and graduates are taught to ask the fundamental question of why. Why did you take that AFO cast in a non-weight bearing position versus partial weight bearing? Or why did you use 3/16 inch polypropylene versus 5/32 of an inch copolymer? Or why are we providing this patient with a blue rocker orthosis instead of one of the 50 other orthoses that are approved by PDAC with this L code due to comparable design and functionality? And it's important to understand that mentors and directors, when they're trained, they're told that these questions are not being done to question their ability necessarily. Some of these questions that are relatively fundamental and simple to an individual trained at the master's level might be something that couldn't be clearly answered by somebody holding that baccalaureate training. Very often, a lot of the ways that were practiced within clinical settings were done on an anecdotal basis. The answer that is how we've always done it was relatively common 2 decades prior. But individuals that are receiving graduate level education have a superior set of inquiry skills. From day one of a master's program, these individuals don't settle on, well, that's how we've always done it. And, all things being equal, we've seen an uptick in a body of evidence to help justify decisions and questions that are being posed, such as the ones on this slide. It's also important to recognize that the regulation of the profession has grown more stringent. While many of Medicare's policies have been relatively stable, the frequency that they're engaging in practices, such as prepayment and recovery audits, for example, has increased considerably over the past decade. These activities have not only placed strain on a practice's cash flow, but increased the relative administrative burden. And even a relatively larger clinical practice will find that having CMS recover the payment for a microprocessor transfemoral prosthesis, that might be an adequate amount of funding to cover a resident's entire salary and benefits. It's also important to recognize that budgeting within the private practice sector and the vast majority of O&P settings are small businesses, and these are done on an annual basis. This presentation is being recorded on October 1st, the very first day of Q4 of 2020. On that note, today, most companies don't know their budget for the subsequent fiscal year. They don't know if they're going to have funding to cover that resident that would be starting typically in the spring or summertime of 2021. And the performance of the practice from a financial standpoint may influence their ability to hire. So they might not be able to even know whether or not it's financially prudent to bring a resident on until next calendar year. Now let's take a moment to talk about residency program types, tracks, and settings. Residency program types have always offered orthotic or prosthetic single discipline residency. These programs are a minimum of 12 months in duration on a full-time basis. One thing of interest, though, is a dual discipline residency was created and approved within the last 10 years. The dual discipline residency allows the resident to learn both orthotics and prosthetics simultaneously, and the total duration of this one program is just 18 months. So you can be trained in O&P 6 months quicker via dual discipline residency. But it's important to recognize that that residency site needs to have patient populations to enable the resident to spend half their time engaged in prosthetic care and the other half their time engaged in orthotic care. If this can't be done, then those sites are best served offering single discipline residency. And there's a variety of factors that may determine this. There's also 2 unique program tracks, and residency programs are approved to offer the specific tracks. The vast majority of residency programs coast to coast are approved for the clinical track, while a relatively lower percentage are approved for the research and development track. And many residency programs that offer research and development are also approved for the clinical track as well. What's important is that regardless of clinical track or research and development track, the resident must recognize the majority of their time is still being spent in patient care. Our research and development track resident doesn't spend 20 hours a week doing research and development. It simply changes some of the deliverables that are required by the end of the residency. It's also important to identify that residency programs can occur in a variety of settings, but the most common settings that you'll encounter are hospital-based settings as well as private practices. Some examples for hospital-based settings include the Shirley Ryan Ability Lab in Chicago, University of California, San Francisco Hospital, University of Michigan, or even the U.S. Department of Veteran Affairs hospitals. Private practices, these can include facilities, for example, Dankmeyer Orthotics and Prosthetics, located in Linthicum Heights, Maryland, or the Hanger Clinic, which has locations coast to coast. Hanger Clinic actually employs more resident practitioners than any other company within the United States. And at the time of this recording, October 1st, 2020, there are 528 active residency sites. O&P residency is an evolution. Prior to the existence of NCOPE and the residency model, just 1,900 hours of patient care experience was required to be eligible to sit your certification exam. There was no real formal curriculum or structure, simply an attestation by the certified practitioner supervising you. But since 1991, an NCOPE residency has been a requirement, and the vast majority of individuals that will be supervising The residents of today and tomorrow will have completed an NCOPE accredited residency program themselves. But keep in mind, prior to 2012, those individuals were not required to demonstrate competency in patient care. You could finish your residency without necessarily ever having fit, for example, a transfemoral prosthesis. In 2012, however, NCOPE adopted what's known as a competency-based residency program model, and it is still in place today. And we'll take some time to talk about the specific competencies that are required, whether you pursue an orthotic or a prosthetic residency. But before we get too deep into the nuts and bolts of the way a residency program is administered, it's important to recognize that the vast majority of residency sites are businesses, small businesses actually. There's only one publicly traded company in the patient care sector of orthotics and prosthetics. Historically, I found that prospective residents typically want access to a diverse patient population, supervisors that have a genuine passion for teaching and training, and environments where they can grow as individuals, and potentially grow even after residency, perhaps get hired on as a staff practitioner or become a lab manager, maybe even an owner. Remember, the vast majority of these companies are small businesses. And business owners typically want individuals with a strong work ethic, the ability to work as part of a team, and a resident that appreciates that the clinical practice still needs to operate while they educate. They can't necessarily decide who walks through that door. So it's entirely possible the resident may have to fit an additional pair of foot orthoses well after they've demonstrated competence at providing such a device. But on that note, I believe the intersection of being a business owner versus a resident is the patient. It's entirely possible to operate a financially responsible organization while offering training opportunities that will develop the clinicians of tomorrow. And in reality, most companies want to give their residents the best residency experience possible. But again, residents must understand that the business owners do have somewhat limited control of the patients that might be walking through the door. It's also important to recognize that companies don't generally throw residents into the proverbial fire, if you will. But do recognize it's not unrealistic that a resident be minimally capable with the skills emphasized in school. Clinical assessment skills, taking impressions, basic fabrication skills, trimming, buffing, finishing, and even basic troubleshooting skills. If you see a lateral leaning pylon at mid-stance on a person with a transtibial prosthesis, which bolt would you tighten on the proximal tube clamp? That should be somewhat intuitive to you before pursuing that residency. It's also important to recognize that you, and when I say you, I mean the resident, will have responsibilities, and these normally increase as you gain more experience and exposure. But the residents are going to be held to the same employment standards that everyone else in that office is, whether it be the front office administrator, the technician, or the senior most clinician. NCOPE is not a human resources organization. So if the resident reports 3 days in a row late, and the HR policy states any employee that's late on 3 consecutive days is automatically terminated, there's nothing that NCOPE can do in those instances. A common question that is asked of individuals within NCOPE is, do prospective residency sites care about grades? And I can verify several practices require unofficial transcripts, including the hospital setting, the University of Michigan, as well as the Hanger Clinic. And in general, good grades do demonstrate the ability to multitask. As residents know, you do keep quite busy if you're pursuing a master's level degree in prosthetics and orthotics. You're not taking just one course at a time. It also demonstrates that the candidate has the ability to meet expectations. And if they earned an A, well, if the grading scale says 90% or up is an A, they meet expectations at least 90% of the time. But also residency sites, even the University of Michigan and Hanger Clinic, recognize that grades have limitations. Earning an A in a course doesn't mean that you'll have a level of ability or proficiency as somebody who's experienced and certified. You're going to need repetitions to develop appropriate skills, and that's where the residency truly demonstrates its value. Let's talk a little bit about the hunt for a residency position. Future residents often ask, when should I start reaching out? It's important to recognize that networking is a life skill, and you're going to want to employ it on an ongoing basis, even well after you've completed your residencies. And it's important to understand that these candidates should make a strong first impression, but identify that a second or third impression counts as well. So if you're going to spend some time during, say, a break during the academic semester or during a clinical placement while you're still in school, make sure you continue to offer a positive impression. It's also perfectly okay for individuals interested in a residency to introduce themselves to a company and ask if there's any potential opportunities, but I wouldn't call up the residency director and have the first question out of your mouth be, are you going to hire a resident next year? Remember, most companies don't even have their budget set for the subsequent fiscal year. They might not be sure. And also, a pro tip, why don't you let the company know why you've reached out to them? What do you find interesting about their practice that would make it a good residency site for you? Because at the end of the day, there's no truly one best residency site for everyone. The best residency site is going to depend on your personal needs and interests. But if you do reach out to a company, you should be able to have a brief conversation and an understanding of what's going on. For example, if you were to call up Robert Lipschitz, the residency director at the Shirley Ryan Ability Lab, you should be able to explain to Robert, I've been doing some research about the prosthetic and orthotic clinic, and it looks like you do a very high percentage of upper limb prosthetic care. In particular, upper limb management using external power. I'd be really fascinated to sit in on a targeted muscle reinnervation fitting. Do residents get to do that? And Robert would be happy to tell you, yes, they do. But being able to actually hold a conversation about that program will certainly get you some credibility at minimum. Now, if you're going to engage in outreach, an email is usually a good place to start, although it's important to recognize that while you may be a student watching this video and your faculty members, odds are, reply to you within no more than one business day, that's not always commonplace for individuals who are serving as residency directors, because these individuals also typically have busy patient loads, and heck, many of them are even clinical managers and running the facility too. But when you do open up, if you can find some points of commonality, the fact that both of you may have attended the same university or had the same major, that could certainly be interesting. And if you're thinking, where would I find that? You'll find most practitioners have that information on their bios. But also, if you hop on LinkedIn, that information is routinely available as well. And when you reach out to them, identify the good things that you've heard about the residency program after doing your research. And identify if there's any opportunities for you to potentially spend some time at that facility before being a resident. I can't encourage you enough to spend some time trying to understand what the residency day-to-day is going to look like. A phone conversation is great, but if the opportunity presents for you to spend a day, take full advantage of it. The other piece of advice that I can offer you is each email that you do send out, make sure that you customize it and personalize it. There's nothing wrong with having some boilerplate to create structure, but make sure you actually identify the residency director by name and the facility by name and what is unique about that facility. And the other thing, make sure that you've done your homework and you've read up on the program. You'd be amazed what you can find on their websites and social media pages and other sources, LinkedIn. You want to make sure that you show that you have an understanding and have done the homework. Another question that I'm often asked is, do I need to provide a resume? And at the end of the day, now that we're in a relatively digital world, it's certainly easy to provide a resume. No longer do you need to carry around a folder that is unbendable to protect your precious resumes on your nice paper. And if the residency site routinely hires residents, and I can tell you there's many, A lot of them are within hospital-based settings, such as the University of Michigan. Then you may want to consider attaching your resume in a digital manner. But also, if you're just simply trying to get some more information about the company, you don't even know if you'd consider working there yet, you might not want to include that resume. And it's also important to recognize that digital resume, you're going to have to upload it again anyway when you submit your application for the residency program using the OP ResCast tool. But we'll talk about OP ResCast in just a little bit. And while I focused a lot on digital communication, and there's certainly nothing wrong with a good email, phone communication is certainly appreciated by many. And if you do have some time to have that residency director or another individual within the program chat with you, make sure that you demonstrate gratitude for their time. And focus on being more of an active listener than a speaker. But on that note, if the conversation is stalling, and there's a lot of dead air, if you will, don't hesitate to make the quick statement. I understand your time is valuable. Could you suggest a good time to follow up so we can discuss opportunities at a later date? That's a nice transition. And also, demonstrate that you have a genuine interest in the facility. If you did your homework and you're on the phone with them, you should be able to talk extemporaneously for about 2 minutes about that program if you've actually looked up Google info, visited their Facebook page, done your homework. The other thing is, please don't keep that individual on the phone longer than necessary. Odds are they have a whole lot of other things to be concerned with as well. And my pro tip, catch them in the morning, typically shortly after the business opens. You'll find that if they are a busy clinician, their lunch hour may get crunched a little bit if any patient is running late or ran long. And at the end of the day, well, a busy clinical practice is going to have a lot of loose ends that need to be tied up before they can call it a day. So odds are they're going to be quite busy then too. So earlier in the day, that would probably be a great time to connect with them. Now let's talk about the more formal process of applying. OP ResCast, or the Orthotic Prosthetic Residency Centralized Application Service, is hosted by our trusted partner Liaison. They also host OPCAS, the Common Application Service for master's level O&P programs as well. So if you've applied to the master's programs with OPCAS, you're likely familiar with what a CAS, or Common Application Service, is. For those of you that aren't, it's a full-service web-based application tool that enables the candidates to apply to multiple programs via a single web application. For the individuals that are actually looking for residents on the system, it streamlines their review process as well. So it ultimately makes the application process for candidates more efficient and the review process more efficient as well. And more importantly, it is a requirement that the residency programs use it if they were accredited on or after the 1st of July, 2017. And it's important to recognize, at the time of this recording, October 1st, 2020, 85% of residency programs should be on the OP ResCast service. So odds are they're a necessity for them to use it. There's only one clinical group that does not use the OP ResCast tool because of a data sharing agreement in place, and that is the Hanger Clinic. Their application process is defined on their NRP, National Residency Program website. All others, you should look to OP ResCast first. But also, you might be thinking, I would really like to just talk with some individuals from these companies before I necessarily submit an application or pay any fees. And actually, speaking of OP ResCast fees, those application fees, your first 3 applications are 100% subsidized by NCOPE. And if you're watching this prior to November 6th of 2020, NCOPE's hosting a free online virtual recruitment fair that will feature dozens of accredited residency programs looking for your applications on OP ResCast and just looking for good residents coast to coast. So please mark your calendar. What I'd like to do now is shift gears. Let's imagine you've landed that residency position that you're most excited about. what's going to ultimately define and shape the residency. And it's going to be the NCOPE Residency Standards. And they're broken into 5 parts. In terms of your personal roles and responsibilities, you're going to be most responsible for standard number 5, what is expected of the resident themselves. But I want to talk through how the other standards are going to affect the delivery and execution of your training during residency, that second half of your education. All residency programs are required to have a mission statement, and this mission should be aligned with education and development of an individual. So understanding their focus for what they want to do with trainees is going to be key. The other thing too is residency programs are aware that new graduates are not trained to be independent clinicians. Walking out the door with your master's degree in O&P, you're probably not quite ready to go ahead and walk into the room without anybody helping you out just yet. Maybe on some cases, but certainly not the typical load that would be expected of, say, a certified orthotist or a certified prosthetist. Now, the program needs to also be consistent in the way that it executes the training. As a future certified or licensed orthotist or prosthetist, you need to be comfortable providing comprehensive patient care. An entire episode of care includes assessment, formulation of treatment plan, implementation from measurement and casting to fitting and delivery of the device. Patient education is even part of implementation. There's also a need for follow-up, as well as practice management, documentation, billing, and coding. You must be competent in all aspects of patient care in order to actually be ready for your board exam and to begin working as an independent practitioner. And it's important to recognize that these residency programs should be engaged in a degree of self-assessment and reflection similar to the O&P schools you've attended or are likely attending right now. They should be identifying successful completion of residency. If they had 3 residents start in 2019, did they all finish? And did those individuals do well on their board exams? And also, how consistent were they with their documentation of clinical exposures? Were they able to attain competency earlier on so that they could develop even higher levels of ability or independence? Or did it take the entire 12 months for them to just meet NCOPE's minimum expectations? The programs have access to a considerable volume of data, much of which is actually sourced by you, the resident, in terms of your clinical experiences and exposures. This will allow the programs to recognize their strengths and address potential shortcomings, and also provide ongoing assessment of their own efficacy on an ongoing basis. Let's keep working our way through the standards. Standard 2 focuses on residency requirements, and the program's required to be clear about the actual employment requirements. I can tell you that NCOPE considers you a full-time resident if you're working a minimum of 37.5 hours per week. On that note, the vast majority of residency programs have expectations in excess of this. So please don't walk out the door once you hit 37.5 hours per week, especially if there's a couple of chart notes that need to be done or a cast that needs to be modified. Furthermore, residents must be supervised and their charts must be countersigned within 15 days of the initial record. Although I'd be surprised if many sites waited that long. You'll find that co-signing and documentation typically occurs much more rapidly than even this. And you'll remember, 2012 is when the competency-based residency came into effect. And residents pursuing a prosthetic residency must demonstrate competency in transtibial, transfemoral, upper limb, Symes and/or partial foot, and postoperative care. And when I say postoperative, that's not just reporting to the hospital and seeing a patient after surgery. That is applying a rigid or movable dressing, or a shrinker, or an immediate postoperative prosthesis. Individuals pursuing an orthotic residency must demonstrate competence in the 7 areas listed here: foot orthoses, ankle foot orthoses, knee orthoses, KAFO, TLSO, upper limb, And similar to prosthetic management, you'll see that upper limb is general because we recognize the volume is lower. So you may wind up fitting a considerable number of WHOs or EWHOs or shoulder, elbow, wrist, hand orthoses. It depends on your setting. And last but not least, scoliosis. And regardless of whether you're pursuing a prosthetic residency, an orthotic residency, or a combined, technical competency must also be demonstrated as well. A common misconception, and one that I am constantly reinforcing with individuals, whether they be residents or the directors and mentors, is that competence is defined as having sufficient knowledge, judgment, and skill to provide appropriate treatment interventions. It does not suggest proficiency, which is actually an even higher level of ability, or a high level of skill. For example, mastery. If your residency director has been practicing for decades, and many have, odds are they're well beyond competent. They've likely achieved levels of mastery, if you will. Now let's talk a little bit more about the requirements. Beyond just being competent with the interventions described on the last slide, clinical track and research track residents each have responsibilities. A clinical track resident is not devoid or able to completely not be engaged in understanding research methods and evidence-based practice. You'll notice critically appraised topics, journal club presentations. That sounds an awful lot like you should still be a good consumer of research, and that's true. Case presentations, professional in-services, and presentations at grand rounds, state, regional, or international meetings also count. Each one of these activities listed can only be repeated twice over the course of a residency, even if you're doing a dual discipline residency. Now, research and development track residents, they're going to be asked to provide quarterly updates. But at the end of the day, the threshold that needs to be met is the delivery of a final research project that is approved by their program director. So that's the end goal, is a large deliverable, while clinical track residents have relatively modest and smaller deliverables done each quarter. As we've already discussed, the goal of the residency is to develop competency, to become competent. And previously, the tools and resources that were used to document this by the residency mentors and directors had two respective tiers, competent and not competent. But as you're already aware, there's certainly levels of ability beyond competent, and there's definitely levels of ability in between not competent to becoming competent. That latter actually looks a lot more like this: beginner, developing, advancing, competent, and proficient. There's even a whole nother rung, mastery, above and beyond that. So competence, it's truly not the end of the road. But just as any road has an end, we need to understand its beginning. And your start is at the level of beginner, when a resident has no experience with a task and usually has difficulty with the skill or behavior, requiring basic information and close supervision. This is actually very common in situations for relatively rare interventions. For example, fitting a hemipelvectomy prosthesis is something that probably none of the students did during their master's level training. Or if they did, it was on a relatively limited basis during a unique clinical rotation. Most graduates are going to be beginners. The next level is developing. And this is a situation where, again, there may be limited experience, but the difficulty or the degree of reinforcement and supervision is going to decrease. And you'll find that as we work our way through the levels, we see a relative decrease in the amount of required supervision and reinforcement until we achieve competent. Competent is when the resident virtually always performs skills or behaviors effectively, but may require assistance or guidance in unusual circumstances. For example, a resident, if they're truly competent, should be able to provide a thermoplastic ankle-foot orthosis to an adult that requires management, that is able to communicate and has a history of using devices before, that has relatively normal shape and alignment. On that note, Let's imagine a more difficult scenario. Let's talk prosthetics this time. A patient with a Van Ness rotationplasty who's getting their initial prosthesis fitting shortly after their surgery. That requires a level of ability well beyond competence. Honestly, that's going to be one of the most difficult scenarios to fit that I could possibly imagine. That's a level where mastery is usually needed in order to manage these individuals, given the challenges of not only managing a person at the transfemoral level, but harnessing the ankle to drive and move the prosthetic knee, and then addressing any instabilities that may be occurring at the hip, and also over time understanding rotational challenges. You have to be well beyond competent to manage that type of case. But let's say you can manage a case such as this Van Ness rotationplasty scenario. Well, then you've truly achieved mastery, where without failure, you always perform a skill or behavior effectively, even when faced with highly unusual circumstances. Will a resident often get to the mastery level? I'd say actually very, very rarely may they do that. But it's not uncommon for a resident to become proficient, the level of ability between mastery and competency, where they're able to perform skills or behaviors even in some of the more unusual circumstances. Now, as a resident works towards the achievement of competency, or maybe even beyond, keep in mind that that resident must be given progressively increasing responsibility with the delivery of patient care services. And initially, supervision must be direct in nature. Keep in mind that direct doesn't mean that the supervisor is seated immediately next to that resident, although it's not uncommon to have your supervisor in the room with you working very closely initially. Direct supervision, as defined by ABC, is when the supervisor is physically present in the same building. And if you're in a small 1,200 square foot office, well, direct supervision, they could probably hear you cough next door. But what if you're in a hospital setting? The University of California, San Francisco? That hospital is tens of thousands of square feet. Even if you yelled at the top of your lungs, your supervisor can be in the same building, albeit on the opposite corner, and never hear you. That too is technically direct supervision. But don't perseverate on the idea of direct supervision so much as indirect. That's the goal of this slide. What we want to talk about is the transition to indirect supervision, and that should occur only when clinical competence has been demonstrated. Indirect supervision does not require the supervising credentialed practitioner to be physically on site, but they must be available for consultation throughout the patient care process. A good example is having the resident go to a hospital to take an impression for an ankle-foot orthosis, while the supervisor stays back at the office to see another patient. That resident shouldn't be going off and doing hospital calls unless they've achieved competence. And when we say achieving competence, this doesn't just occur by the mentor saying, "Congrats, you're now competent." There's specific forms and documentation that must be on file with NCOPE for this to occur. Also, keep in mind that if the resident is operating in a manner that's indirect in nature, this resident shouldn't have mileage exceed 120 miles a day. And this isn't one way, this is round trip, 60 miles out, 60 miles back. Why? Because the best learning is going to occur in a clinical setting, not within the car. I'm going to shift gears one more time. I want to talk about creating a roadmap, if you will. And this relates to the data that's provided not just by the residents, but also the supervisors and mentors. You'll remember one of NCOPE's main goals is to be a data-driven organization. Clinical hour tracking data provides you, the resident, as well as your mentors and directors, a snapshot of your patient exposures and relative involvement. So just as the learning management system you're probably using in school, whether it be Canvas or Blackboard, Angel, or any other system, gives you a dashboard view of how your education's going, your clinical hours is where you go to review how your residency experience is going. And those clinical hours are documented in a tool, known as NCOPE Tracker. It's also important to recognize that while many residency programs retain their residents, you'll typically get a job offer if everything goes well by the end of your residency. Some don't. Some can't. They have human resource policies that say you must have been certified for at least a year in order to join the staff. And they'll have to send you on your way even if you were the best resident ever. Those are scenarios where your clinical hours not only will demonstrate the education, but also can create a portfolio that you can share with your future employers. Because if you happen to have a residency that was exceptional, but they can't bring you onto the staff for whichever reason, you now have a portfolio to demonstrate to your next employer why you would be exceptional. Also, the data that's entered by the residents informs the sites about potential areas for improvement. If a site begins to identify, wow, our residents aren't getting as much scoliosis experience as we thought, that may be the trigger to have them create a relationship with a local pediatric practice or children's hospital. But regardless, to go back to the roadmap metaphor, I want you to understand that that roadmap is only appropriate if it's truly drawn accurately. Let's focus on clinical hour tracking in particular. As you already know, there's a major initiative to use and leverage data for the benefit of the profession. Decisions that are made on an administrative level by NCOPE, its staff, the board of directors, and its volunteers are relying on good data. And there was a system that was used prior to NCOPE Tracker by residents. It was called Typhon. The Typhon platform is not designed for orthotics and prosthetics. At the end of the day, Typhon could be used for virtually any healthcare provider, but since it was so general, it was difficult to extrapolate meaningful information about what an O&P student or resident was truly up to. So regarding the documentation of your clinical experience, NCOPE truly needs your help. I'm appealing to the future and current residents that you make sure you're diligent with your case logs. Any patient encounter greater than or equal to 15 minutes should be logged. And when we say encounter, it's not just the time you're face-to-face with that patient. If that patient's only in the room with you for 10 minutes, but it takes you 10 minutes to grind on their foot orthoses, glue on some new top covers, and another 10 minutes to do your chart note, that's a 30-minute encounter, and that absolutely should be logged at NCOPE Tracker. Also, the residents must complete their quarterly evaluations in a timely manner and complete them in an honest manner as well. If you're having an experience that is going well, the program faculty should be aware of it. And if it's not going so well, if you insist that it is going excellent, but it could be much better, odds are the program director and the mentors aren't going to do anything to improve upon it either. Also, you are signing an attestation when you're filling out these evaluation forms as well, that you are providing honest and accurate info. Also, it's important to recognize areas for your personal growth as well, as you get to do a degree of self-assessment. So if there's areas that you could personally improve upon, identify them, discuss them with your mentors and your directors. Be reflective so that you can focus on those and get the most out of your residency. Now, as a current resident or even a soon-to-be resident, you may have talked to individuals that ultimately pursued residency using some of the old system data. And while we've always had a rule at NCOPE that all cases greater than or equal to 15 minutes need to be logged, they weren't scrutinized as closely by the residency directors or mentors. So why the push now? Why this conversation? Why is it being recorded and put on YouTube for the public? Accountability. As an accreditor, NCOPE is scrutinized at multiple levels, including by CAHEP, our parent credentialing body, CHIA, the Council for Higher Education Accreditation, and they require us to maintain accurate documentation of educational processes. And those case logs, those are documentation the same way your quizzes and your grades and your term papers were during school. Residency is the second half of your education, and those case logs are proof that education is occurring and is occurring in an appropriate manner. I'd also like to remind the residents, future as well as present, that your clinical data informs NCOPE policy. Questions such as, is the 18-month residency model continuing to be viable? To what degree of autonomy are residents engaging through each quarter of the residency? Is there an ideal amount of encounters needed for a specific competency in order to be successful on their boards? Or are there any other factors that consistently lead to board exam success or even future success? What if we could look at your first 2 quarters of residency and say, great news, we're 95% confident you'll pass your board exams based upon your current distribution of experiences and exposures. That level of predictive analytics is possible, and we have a potentially large enough data set to do it. But again, only if the quality of the data is good and it's truly accurate. The big question that needs to be asked with the data that we're cleaving from NCOPE Tracker, though, is the residency program offering comprehensive experiences with both diagnoses and devices to support resident training? I mentioned there's 528 accredited sites, and those sites do need to demonstrate that they have opportunities for the required learning experiences to occur. And if they're not occurring, should the program continue to be accredited? Or do they need to create some relationships so that they can be accredited and continue to offer a residency where maybe that resident spends 1 day a week down the road at a different location or a different facility altogether? That data also answers another fundamental question. If there's no cases logged, is there any proof that the residency has in fact occurred? Getting a paycheck, unfortunately, is not grounds to demonstrate competence. So the fact that you're paid on an ongoing basis as a resident in most cases is wonderful. But beyond the paycheck, what learning activities occurred? And that's where the logging of all this clinical data is imperative. Now, on that note, I recognize there's a lot of information here. And you're probably going to want to review some of that. And you may be thinking, is there anywhere else I could look to go through that? And I'm pleased to say, absolutely. You can review all the information we've already discussed. It's available on our website. And actually, we even have it in exponentially more detail. What I'd like to do now is give everyone a brief tour of the NCOPE website, which was newly redesigned and developed on January 1st of 2020. Let's take a quick tour, guys. I'm pleased to say the new NCOPE website is mobile optimized, so you can enjoy this on your phone or your tablet just as easily as you can on a computer monitor. At the end of the day, NCOPE has 2 principal groups of stakeholders, those engaged in academic programs, students and faculty members, if you will, and those engaged in residency and professional experiences, the residency directors and mentors. And if you're a current student who wants to learn about that next step, residency, the logical place to click is going to be Residency and Professional Experiences. And when you select that, it's been designed to help you navigate through the process based upon your current role. If you're a current or future resident, clicking on the Future and Current Resident button is going to be more informative than if you select Residency Directors, Supervisors, and Administrators, because each of you has unique pieces of information. There's some overlap, but if you want it tailored to your individual needs, go ahead and click Future and Current Residents. And once you do that, you see that there's a whole additional submenu available. Common links such as the OP ResCast application, the registration form, which you're going to submit prior to the start of your residency to document with NCOPE that you're ready to begin your training, or even resources to learn about NCOPE Tracker, the clinical tracking software that we've been discussing, are there. You'll notice that within the menu, there's drop-down information. So we even have separate FAQs for both future as well as current students. You'll find that roughly 90% of the questions that are broached by future residents are answered here. And if it's not, don't hesitate to contact the NCOPE staff. The easiest way to do that is to simply click Contact NCOPE. Once you do that, we actually have a form designed to address and route your inquiry to the correct person. If you're an aspiring resident or a current resident, or a residency director or a residency mentor, or even hope to be a mentor or director in the future, make sure you select the topic Residency Programs and Other Professional Experiences, because if you pick something else, for example, that's not going to be sent to the individuals that actually help out with the residency program. So make sure you select residency programs and other experiences. And what you'll find is as you go through it, it will even suggest links and resources that will likely be helpful and guide you. Take a peek at these because, well, again, most of the questions that folks tend to ask are answered using these links. Speaking of residency and professional experience, as I mentioned, there's a good amount of overlap in information that both the director and mentor as well as the resident needs to be aware of. If you hover to the top menu of the NCOPE website, the first column, Requirements and General Info, that's information that's going to be useful for everybody. And one of the things that I find individuals who are seeking out residency are most interested in our accredited residency program directory. And when we select that, it may take a few moments to load, but once everything loads up, we actually have all of our accredited residency programs listed here. And you can learn more about each respective program by clicking the small arrows to expand the record. So if you're interested in FAAOP prosthetics, for example, in Alabama, you can click on the arrow and it'll provide you information such as the site ID, which you're going to need when you register. This is a unique number for each program. It's also going to tell you what program types are offered. And I can tell you, FAAOP only offers a prosthetic residency. They don't offer anything else. You'll also have the mailing address information as well as the current program director listed. This is a nice resource, and most importantly, let's say you know a company name and would like to learn more about them. You can simply click the little hourglass and type in a name, and it'll even highlight it for you and identify. There's actually 2 records that are relevant here. And in this case, it's the city of Dothan, Alabama, and also the name of the practice, Dothan Brace Shop. So this is certainly helpful. And speaking of search, if you're thinking, Chris, this is one of the biggest menus I've ever seen on a website, I'd say, well, there's a lot of information. What if you just want to do a quick search? You got some questions about NCOPE Tracker. Well, that's pretty darn easy. You can just type in NCOPE Tracker by clicking the little hourglass. And when you hit enter, it'll go ahead and link you to all the resources that are relevant to that service. So hopefully that quick tour will help you out in terms of navigating the website and certainly reaching the NCOPE staff. If you remember one thing about our website tour, if you can't find that information by searching for it, reach out to us. Just click Contact NCOPE, and we'd be more than happy to interact with you. We also have our phone number listed below. And please note, our normal business hours are based on East Coast time. We're normally open from 9 o'clock a.m. until 5 o'clock p.m., Monday through Friday. And on that note, our time's almost up. Not quite a full hour, and I know it was an awful lot of information. But I want to thank you for your time. And if at any point you'd like to reach out to the NCOPE staff, who'd be more than happy to help you out with your residency questions or queries, don't hesitate to reach out to us. Just go to ncope.org